Here we go. The last video that you have to watch for the year, unless you want to watch others. Even my daughter's happy about that. So I went over some things in class. Remember, this was not made for our class, but for all the classes. So it covers less material than we covered, which hopefully is a good thing for you. And a lot of it is stuff that we learned through the content material and through our Constitution curriculum. And also remember that most of these are not asked just like as a straight up multiple choice question, but you have to infer their answer based on primary source documents. So that would mean like letters or speeches or diary entries or things like that, right? Make sure you know what a primary source is. You guys are very good at annotating, understanding, analyzing, and interpreting them. So I think you'll do well, but I just want to make sure that you at least have the background knowledge and know the different things. Also, some of this material was covered by your midterm. So if you have your midterm study guide, take that out, find it. It should be helpful. So, chronologically speaking, we're going things that led to the revolution, things we were covering back in the fall, right? And a lot of things led to the revolution, but some things to focus on a little bit is the Stamp Act Congress, which was the first time, of course, Ben Franklin tried it with the Albany plan, but the first time that the different colonies agreed to send representatives to meet. And it was a unified protest against all the various forms of British taxation that they thought was unjust. And there's a bunch of different ways that the colonists protested these taxes. Of course, you should be aware of the most famous one being the Boston Tea Party of December 16th, 1773. And as a reaction to some of the other measures the British were taking, they didn't like the harbor being shut off of the different monopolies, all those things. And as a result of this, the British stepped up their game. They intensified their their um, their actions against the colonists, specifically the ones up here in Massachusetts. And Sam Adams described them as marks of revenge, right? Like those intolerable acts, like you're just trying to get revenge on us. So you should know about those ones. And of course, people sometimes say that, when did the revolution start? John Adams would say it happened in the minds of the people. Some people will say Lexington and Concord. We often can look at the Declaration of Independence. And we learned a lot about this. I don't know if I like how I bulleted this, but remember it outlined the principles of the Declaration, right? The golden apple, right? So the ideas of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, those principles of consent of the governed, right? Self-government, all that sorts of stuff. So you have that in the Declaration. It also has those, remember we talked for so long about those long chain of abuses. He did this, he did that, right? He didn't make me dinner that day, right? All these complaints against the king. Doesn't really mention anything about dinner, right? So that, like, showing all the way that he violated their sacred rights. Uh, and of course, this is sort of like the official, if you want to say, start of the revolution, and leads to the war. They didn't have a plan for how this government was going to work yet, though, right? It's like, okay, like shoot first, we'll aim afterwards. So this goes out, and then we fight the war, and we win, and we have the Articles of Confederation. But remember, we discussed all the various ways why the Articles of Confederation didn't work. So then you get the Constitutional Convention. We went into great detail about that, but you won't need to know all those details. But now that the convention signs off on, like, okay, this is good, this is the Constitution, ready to go, you have to then convince the states to ratify it, right? And some states were like, we don't think so, especially the larger states that felt like they were going to give up a lot of power. So what did some of the people do to get them to, I'm actually going to come back to this, to get them to support it and ratify it. Well, that was the Federalist Papers. So these were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, and they were published with the intent of convincing the New York people, right? They run in New York to support it. But of course, it did spread through besides outside New York. George Washington kept a copy and considered it his guidebook to how the Constitution works, because that's what it does. It's all the different essays outlined the various parts of the branches of government, um, public sentiments, and just how the parts of the Constitution were going to work. So, basically, addressed everything, right? So here is a little bit about that Constitution that it was defending. So remember the Constitution, as Lincoln used the paraphrase that was actually from Proverbs, one of the Proverbs, I believe, is that the principles that we already said were the apple of gold were thus protected by the frame of silver, and that being the Constitution, right? So the Constitution is the structure, is the framework of how the government will work that will protect those principles. So it explains the three branches of government, right? You should all know what those are: legislative, executive, and judicial. It outlines the checks and balances and how they each overlap a little bit of powers and make sure that none of the other branches are abusing their powers. We make sure you know about the compromises we discussed, especially the Great Compromise, right? Go back to your notes if you forget, but how basically that combines the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan, and it's sometimes called the Connecticut Plan or the Great Compromise, because you had two big issues at the Constitutional Convention, being the power between big states and small states, right, and how they would be represented. And then you also had, which many scholars will argue was really the biggest issue, was slave states versus non-slave states, and how would they be represented. And one of the ways that they decided for that representation was in the three-fifths compromise, where three-fifths of slaves in states would be counted for representation in government. All right. We also have various amendments. You don't need, they're not, the final is not going to ask you like your last test about, the different powers of the First Amendment and things like that. I think a good one to know is the 12th Amendment, only because it shows a change in how that representation and structure occurred. Remember, in the original Constitution, before the 12th Amendment, whoever was running for president, whoever finished second was the vice president. Can you imagine? I always say that. Can you imagine? I've asked you that before. I think that would have been incredible today. But the 12th Amendment is what changed that. All right. So then the Constitution does get ratified finally. We have George Washington as our first president, John Adams as our first vice president. He has his cabinet with Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, as Jefferson as Secretary of State. And let's test this Constitution out, right? Let's make some precedents and see how it works. And one of the first challenges was the Whiskey Rebellion. And unlike Shays' Rebellion, which showed the weakness of the Articles, while still controversial, the Whiskey Rebellion showed the strength of the Constitution. This was in 1794. Remember, we learned about this, about the corn farmers out in western Pennsylvania. It was much cheaper to ship whiskey, and they also used it as an economic source instead of money, as like a bartering tool. And they protested. Some people thought they were going to succeed. And then Washington wanted to show that that this kind of thing that caused a problem under the Articles could not exist in the Constitution. He, as president, goes out there on his horse with the army, with former general, right, Secretary Hamilton, and they crush the protests. I did mention Hamilton was Treasury Secretary, and remember, he was really responsible for putting this new economic system together, how to conduct how to pay off the debt. And one of the tools he derived was the national bank, right, which was controversial, but he helped establish it. Thank my daughter for the musical accompaniment. Also, no, but by the time George Washington does step away after his second term, his farewell address, go check it out. It's super famous. Now, his initial farewell address was written by Madison when he thought he was going to step down after 4 years. But he did a second term, which is now a precedent. Hamilton at this point modifies, adds his points to the farewell address. And there's three big points that this focuses around. And the first important point, which is hugely critical, is union. The fact that our country was one union. Stop looking at us as separate states, right? That's how it was under the Articles. Under the Constitution, we are one country. He traveled up and down the country several times to spread this theme of unity. And he's not the only one to even talk um, about unity and why it was so important. So that's the first part. The second part is political parties. He warned against them, pointed out why they were dangerous. One thing is it causes disunity, right? You see the polarization. So if you're trying to form unity, don't create something that forms disunity. So he warned against political parties. And then he also avoided against foreign entanglements. Don't be getting in alliances with foreign countries, primarily because we're still a young country. Our army and navy is not even we don't even have a standing army, but we didn't have it for a while. But it's just not a good idea. We're a young country. Stay away. And then there's just a little bit on what happens after Washington. Not anywhere near as far as where we got. Nowhere near the Civil War. Nowhere near Jackson. But remember, you have Washington, then you have Adams, a Federalist. Then after the election of 1800, you have Jefferson winning. And Jefferson winning is the first time that we changed political parties, right? Oh, we're not dying here. Changing political parties. So you had change of hands from the executive being of one party to another. And actually, the Federalists were all three parties. It was right because the president put in Federalist judges. It was mostly a Federalist Congress. Jefferson, these kids aren't graduating; they're not seniors. But Jefferson know about the Louisiana Doctrine, how it really did expand executive power, how it expanded the United States to about twice the size of the area in green. This map isn't great because it doesn't really show you what the U.S. was at the time. It shows you like what it is now, but all that green was acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. And know about Monroe, right? So even though you had no entangling alliances, no foreign entanglements under Washington, by the time you have Monroe, president number 5, he's warning like, hey, other countries, stay out of our hemisphere. If you get involved with other countries in our hemisphere, we'll see that as a hostile engagement. And that's the Monroe Doctrine, right? I think that's all. I did want to mention mercantilism. We covered that earlier in the year, but it's the idea that as we were a colony, we would send materials to the mother country, then they would manufacture things, and then they would sell it back at higher prices. And I think that's it. But like I said, you're going to be reading a lot of documents and have to be inferring things from this. So if you want to practice, read parts of things that I told you here. Read, something about the Stamp Act Congress. Read parts of the farewell address and see if you see any of those themes. You're going to do fine. Just spend a few minutes to remind yourself about all these things. Go over that. Oh, she has a song.
The playlist, just in case I want to listen to this.
Okay, if you ever want this playlist, this is where you'll find it. Is it Spotify? Okay, so let me know and I'll pass on to her if you try it out. All right, see you guys soon.